So we have a new test that is a gene expression signature that is used to differentiate between benign nevi or moles and malignant melanoma in cases where that's difficult to do using just the microscope alone. It works by looking at the expression levels of 23 different genes that we know are more likely to be expressed in melanoma than one of these benign moles. And we measure that expression by quantitative RT-PCR. There's an algorithm that's applied that assigns a weighting value to each one of those genes and then produces a cutoff point and a score that can be plotted such that benign nevi will have a score, most benign nevi have a score less than 0, whereas malignant melanoma will have a score greater than 0. It's important because about 1.5 million pigmented lesions are biopsied every year in the United States. About 15% of those will be very difficult to diagnose using just the microscope. So there's a need for these improvements to our current standard of care. So right now we've only offered the test to dermatopathologists and relatively experienced dermatopathologists who have additional training and additional experience in differentiating those pigmented lesions under the microscope because we want to see how it works in their hands first, and I think that's really the target audience for the test. But we now have over 100 dermatopathologists in this country that are using the test and are part of our early access launch program. And right now we're collecting a lot of data. Some of the data that's going to be presented tomorrow in Lorraine's session is going to be from a dermatopathologist that's been using the test in his practice, and the data that we have that shows that when dermatopathologists use the test, the number of indeterminate cases where they really say, I can't make a definitive diagnosis of whether this is benign or malignant, are reduced substantially with the aid of the test. It is in our first clinical validation study, which we just published a few weeks ago, we had a sensitivity and specificity of 90% and 91% respectively. So it's pretty good. The part of the problem is that there are very few studies that have ever looked at how good are we with just the microscope. We assume that we're pretty good and that we're as good as we can get because that's been around for so long. That's been the gold standard. And yet there are now over 20 peer-reviewed published articles demonstrating this problem, which is that even expert dermatopathologists don't agree on what's benign and what's malignant in at least 15% of cases. I think this is the way, this will be, again, an adjunct to diagnosis. So histopathology, using the microscope, works well in the majority of cases, and we do know that. But it's now become very well recognized that there is this 15% approximately of cases where it just doesn't work well enough. And we need things like this to improve diagnosis in that 15% because it ends up being a lot of patients. The next step is to continue to gather data on the test, which we're doing, and to really characterize how dermatopathologists are using the test in the real world. So it's good to have a validation study that shows 90% and 91%. But what we need to know now is how does it work in those cases that are submitted routinely every day, the diagnostically challenging cases that dermatopathologists as a whole are seeing. And those are the data that we're collecting right now, and it's to analyze how good is the test in those populations.